When Oliver moved into his new home, it was with a sense of optimism that belied the darker undercurrents of his life. Recently promoted and now working in the city, he had found the small, two-story house in a quiet suburb. It was perfect for his needs. Overall, you could say that the place was unremarkable. A modest kitchen, a cozy living room, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. It was the kind of house that might have gone unnoticed in any neighborhood, but it suited him. He was closer to his work and his girlfriend Emma. However, there was one part of the house that caught his attention in an unsettling way. The stairway. It was unusually narrow and steep, the kind of stairs that forced you to grip the railing for support. The walls on either side seemed to press in, and at the top, a single small window let in a weak trickle of light, leaving the lower steps in perpetual shadow. There was something about the staircase that made Oliver uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He tried to dismiss it as just another quirk of the house's design. The first and second nights passed uneventfully. Exhausted from moving, Oliver fell into a deep sleep, waking the next morning with the disorientation expected of someone who has recently moved. He began his new routine, commuting to work, returning home in the evening to eat his TV dinners while watching movies. Life was looking up for Oliver, and yet each night, an uneasy feeling began to creep into his subconscious, like an itch at the back of his mind. On the third night, Oliver woke up suddenly. He didn't know what had startled him awake, but the silence of the house felt oppressive, broken only by the quiet, distant hum of his refrigerator. Even in the still quiet, Oliver sensed something was wrong. Slowly, he got out of bed, feeling his way through the dark to find the door. When he opened it, the hallway was still and dark with a sliver of moonlight peering through the window and down the stairs. The calm did not last for long, however. As his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw it. Near the base of the staircase, just visible in the faint glow from the window, stood a figure. It was tall, inhumanly tall, with strands of oily black hair hanging down its face. Its skin was as pale as death, its eyes wide, white, and unblinking, with small black pupils that seemed to pierce through him. The figure was standing on the second step, staring directly at him. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he must still be dreaming. But then the creature began to move. Slowly, with deliberate precision, it lifted one foot and placed it on the third step, dragging behind it the rest of its foul body. Then it stopped, its head twitching slightly, as if contemplating its next move. Oliver stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut. He sat on the edge of his bed, heart racing, trying to convince himself that what he had seen wasn't real. By morning, the creature was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The daylight brought a temporary sense of relief, and Oliver managed to shake off the lingering fear, telling himself it had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But the next night, it had returned. He awoke to the same sense of dread, the same oppressive silence, and this time, the indistinguishable noise of the creak of wood. The sound seemed so loud to Oliver. It shot through his body and caused his hairs to stand on end. When he opened the door, the creature was there, now standing on the fourth step. This time, its head jerked unnaturally, as though struggling to keep itself upright. Oliver watched in horror as its mouth slowly opened, revealing jagged rows of teeth that seemed to splay out, almost growing in front of his eyes. The creature's head tilted, its neck cracking with a sickening sound, and the teeth began to move, twitching and chattering. Oliver screamed in desperation and fell to the floor, screaming in tears. All rational thought had left him. He scrambled desperately to his room. He kicked hard at his door, causing it to slam shut. There he screamed and cried himself to sleep with his back against the door, utterly tormented. Each night the creature appeared, taking one step closer up the narrow staircase. its twisted mouth filled with those ghastly teeth. During the day, it vanished without a trace, leaving Oliver to question his own sanity. He tried to focus on work, but his mind was constantly drawn back to the staircase, to the creature, to the inevitable nightfall. His co-workers noticed the change in him, his eyes hollow, his responses sluggish. But he brushed off their concerns with forced smiles and weak excuses. It wasn't long before his sleepless nights began to take their toll. Oliver's thoughts became disjointed, his grip on reality slipping with each passing day. He started avoiding the staircase altogether during the day, terrified that he might encounter the monster on the stairs. Desperate for a reprieve, Oliver called his girlfriend Emma and invited her to stay the night. He hadn't told her about the creature. He couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. He thought it must all be a product of his imagination. He hoped this dearly, and that having her there would break his horrific psychosis. On the other hand, he was scared and selfish. If it was real, he had hoped that her presence might somehow break the spell, that the thing would leave him alone if someone else were there. That night, he barely slept, waiting in terrified anticipation for the creak of the staircase. When he finally heard it, the sound was unmistakable. He shook Emma awake, panic lacing his voice. "Do you hear that? It's coming up the stairs," he whispered urgently. Emma, still groggy, frowned at him. "What are you talking about? There's nothing there." "It's here. It's right outside," he insisted, pulling her to the door. But when she looked out into the stairway, she saw nothing. "Stop it, Ollie. You're scaring me," she said, pulling away. "You're just imagining things. You need to get some sleep." But Oliver did not answer, because he could see it, standing not so far away from him, now halfway up the staircase. Its face was twisted, the teeth gnashing together in a grotesque dance, and massive eyes still staring. He could hear the faint clatter of bone against bone as the creature's head jerked and twisted. He could barely bring himself to close the door. The sheer terror of the creature's presence played with his sanity. And yet Emma could not see it. He bargained with himself, telling himself he was imagining it still. He went back to bed and tried to sleep. He felt tears fall from his eyes as he lay silent, the sound to clattering teeth echoing in from the stairway. Emma left the next morning, worried and confused. She promised to call him, but Oliver knew she wouldn't understand. He couldn't bring himself to explain what he was seeing, fearing her inevitable disbelief. The creature, after all, only seemed to show itself to him. His days became an endless blur of anxiety and exhaustion. He started calling in sick more frequently, getting himself out of the house as much as possible. His search for answers became frantic. He scoured the internet, looking for any mention of similar experiences, ghosts, demons, hallucinations. But nothing matched the horror that plagued him each night. He began to spend his days at the local library and council buildings, poring over old records, trying to uncover anything about the house that might explain the creature. There were no hints of tragedy in the house's past, no whispers of a man who had gone mad, no family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Nothing at all. Nothing that could help him. It was as if the creature existed solely to torment him, bound to the staircase, growing closer and closer each night. Oliver stopped sleeping altogether, his nights spent in a state of hyper-alertness, listening for the creak of the next step. By now, the creature was only 2 steps away from the top, from reaching him. The anticipation was worse than the sight of the thing itself. He could almost hear its breath now, a low, rattling sound that seemed to echo in his mind, even when it was silent. The day came when Oliver knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the creature would reach him that night. He didn't bother going to bed, didn't even try to distract himself. Instead, he stood in the hallway, staring down the staircase, waiting. Oliver blinked, and it appeared it was more terrible than he had ever imagined. Its head jerked and twisted with a violent intensity, the teeth clattering together in a sickening rhythm. Its eyes, its relentless, staring, quaking eyes, bore into him, its pupils rattling in its head, piercing into Oliver's as it leered down at him. Slowly it grinned widely and took the penultimate step. Oliver's legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, unable to look away as it drew nearer, its grotesque mouth opening wider and wider, the teeth writhing like a nest of serpents. He sat there, broken. They locked gazes with one another for hours. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, Oliver blinked, and the creature vanished, leaving him alone at the top of the staircase. But Oliver couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, his mind shattered by the sheer weight of his terror. Unable to find the strength to stand, he sat there all day, his senses dulled, urine soaking through his clothes, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and despair. As the sun began to set, tears streamed down his face, his mind unable to process anything beyond the impending darkness. He could feel the creature behind him now. He dared not turn around. Its breath was hot against his neck, the sound of the chattering teeth filling his ears. The last of the sunlight disappeared. And then there was silence. The house was still. The next morning, the sun rose on an empty house. The neighbors went about their day and birds chirped happily in the foliage above, unaware of the horror that had unfolded just a few doors down. The only thing that could be heard throughout the small two-story house in a quiet suburb was the echo of footsteps leading slowly back down the narrow staircase.